Yes. I would like to talk to you today about the relationship between the navigation of space in Metroidvania games and the concept of the Gothic turn in 18th century philosophy, which was a precursor to the emergence of Gothic as a recognized literary genre. The title quote is from the hymn to Hallownest in Hollow Knight, and I hope it will make sense by the end of the talk. Just a quick content alert, the talk does touch very briefly on the topic of self-harm and contains potentially disturbing imagery, albeit in a very stylized pixel art form. By the end of the presentation, I hope to have laid out, one, the idea that Metroidvania worlds can be read through the lenses of Gothic conventions from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Two, Humean empiricism, which I will explain, provides a historical model for the blurring of interior and exterior, which is central to both Gothic and concepts of ludic affect. And three, the generic characteristics of Metroidvanias disrupt the empirical process of spatial navigation in the same way as early Gothic literature impacts its audiences. So to begin with, let me define the key term of my talk. Firstly, we have Metroidvania, which I'm sure will be familiar to most of you, but for anyone who isn't, it is the portmanteau used as an unofficial title for challenging action platformers following conventions started by Castlevania and Metroid games in 1986. The core characteristics of the Metroidvania which separate it from other action platformers are non-linear gameplay, in which sections of the game are traversed multiple times in an average playthrough under varying narrative conditions and with the player character in a range of different states. And then two, narrative progress is aligned with the collection of items which provide new capabilities for movement or combat, such as items which allow wall climbing or double jumping to reach areas which were hinted at but not yet accessible. And then three, we have an abstract in-game minimap consisting of undifferentiated rectangles with either no distinguishing features or very limited ones within each rectangle. And as you can see from the bottom of this slide, the style has remained incredibly stable and consistent from 1986 onwards. And I'm going to talk about all of these elements of Gothic literature as I go through the talk, but I'll just do a quick run through of some of the characteristics that I've identified as essential to Gothic literature. We have fear and physiological affect. Gothic literature is often associated with the creation of particular physical responses in its readers. Reactions to early Gothic novels like Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho or Matthew Lewis's The Monk are characterized by racing blood, pounding hearts, and fainting fits. We have the presence of tropes which will later get glossed through the Freudian uncanny, the sensation of the familiar becoming unfamiliar, which is ubiquitous in the haunted houses and bumps in the night of Gothic literature. Then we have a fascination with madness and the limits of human understanding. As I will go on to address, the Gothic emerges from the 18th century Enlightenment with its core belief in the total power of human reason to comprehend the world. Gothic writers were interested in testing the limits of this ideology through explorations of madness and the sublime, experiences which transcended the mind's capacity for understanding. And it's this concept which lies behind many tropes which permeate Gothic fiction, from the mistaken identities and misdirections which inform early Gothic romance, through to the full-blown existential critiques of reason, spiritual arrogance, and scientific hubris in works by Edgar Allan Poe, Matthew Lewis, and Mary Shelley. We can also find the Gothic deeply concerned with sexual threat and the retrenchment of gender roles. Early classic Gothic romances like The Castle of Otranto centered on the abduction and entrapment of their female protagonists by lecherous older men. By the turn of the 19th century, this had progressed in the work of Lewis and Poe to the point of including rape and incest as plot devices. And then in works like the notorious but now underexplored Zofloya by Charlotte Dacre, women's sexuality itself begins to emerge as a Gothic theme, which gradually evolves into the monstrous image of female sexuality that's been described by Barbara Creed through the concept of the monstrous feminine. And then finally, we get the topic which is going to be the focus of most of the rest of this talk, which is the idea of temporal dislocation and the affects associated with it, whether considered through Freudian repression or Derridian hauntology. This interest in being out of time gives rise to many of the concepts which are most immediately associated with Gothic literature: old ruined castles, ancestral curses, and people coming back from the dead, either through plot shenanigans whereby it turned out they were never actually dead in the first place, as in early Gothic romance, or through literal resurrection. And on this slide, I've given you this screen grab from Castlevania Symphony of the Night of Alucard having a quintessential haunting experience, receiving a vision of his mother's death, which galvanizes him in his role to kill his father in a very Hamlet-esque interpretation of a Freudian haunting. And then finally, oh, sorry, that was the temporal dislocation, wasn't the one I'm going to talk about for the rest of the paper. It's blurring of interior and exterior, which I'm going to be focusing on, which unites all of the other categories and is essentially grounded in the idea of the external penetrating the internal via acts of violence, or the internal being projected onto the exterior, which is the center of stories like Edgar Allan Poe's Fall of the House of Usher. Okay. Now that we've had a look at some of the characteristics of Gothic literature, I'd like to give you a very brief account of the evolution of empirical philosophy in the 18th century and how it intersects with the rise of Gothic literature. In brief, empiricism refers to the collection of philosophical ideas which argue that the human mind acquires knowledge and beliefs about the world by receiving sense impressions, and then using reason to align those impressions into a system of understanding. The most famous proponent of the theory was John Locke, who in 1689 conceived of the mind as a blank slate, his famous tabula rasa, in which all knowledge had to be acquired through sense impressions. And core to his belief system was the distinction between the activities of observation and interpretation. You are either observing the world or you're interpreting it, which led to criticism from other philosophers like David Hume that Locke's model of the mind was too passive. In Hume's Treatise of Human Nature in 1740, he made a famous declaration that reason is slave to the passions, which, when it comes to engaging with the world, manifests in his argument that sense impressions are given greater or lesser significance in the mind depending on the force with which they are received. Force here acts something like the modern concept of affect, a combination of physical sensation, emotional reaction, and the predisposition of the observer. So to give a particularly Gothic example, the sense impressions of a graveyard at midday and a graveyard at midnight are not substantively different, but the latter will register with a much higher payload of sensations and emotions, and therefore be more vivid. Now we move on to the end of the 18th century, and as scholars such as Margaret Russell and Catherine Ding have observed, this aspect of Hume's philosophy gets picked up on by Hume's philosophical successors and a generation of writers responding to him in what has become known as the Gothic turn, where focus shifts from force and vivacity as necessary parts of the mind's process of acquiring impressions to a focus on the idea of these internal transformations themselves being the core element of building belief, regardless of what the sense impression was in the first place. So as you can see here, the evolution of empiricism in the 18th century highlights a movement from passive observation through to the ultimate transformation of the self by what it's observing. And thinking back to the previous slide, we can see how a fascination with the permeability of the boundaries of the self can emerge from considering a mind in this way. Here I've given you an example of what the Gothic turn looks like in practice. This quotation from Anne Radcliffe's Mysteries of Udolpho acts as a manifesto for her literary style, which is defined by the trope of the revealed supernatural. The novel itself frequently gives the reader a glimpse of a frightening scene or object, a threatening presence in the room of a recently deceased, a corpse in a hidden alcove, framed through the contingent and emotionally fraught perspective of the protagonist, Emily St. Aubert, provoking terror and agitation in the reader, before ultimately revealing the corpse to be just a wax figure and the threatening movement to be just the family pet. The actual impressions are meaningless compared to the emotions which they elicit. As Radcliffe says, the more veiled the object, the greater its effect. And romantic critic William Hazlitt's response is a perfect encapsulation of how this process works. He is physically and emotionally forced into making the flesh creep and the nerves thrill, into believing a false reality through Radcliffe's power to describe the indefinable. Now, the epistemological premise of building understanding as a process of emotionally predicated internal transformation will not be a surprise to many people in the audience here, I suspect, as these concepts underpin entire schools of thought on how video games work. The practice of heuristic ergodicity, to borrow Astrid Enslin's use of the term, to describe mechanisms by which games teach their rules and mechanics to new players, often depending on the process of repeating actions with slight variation until the core principles of a game become organic and cease to require conscious attention. Cameron Kunzelman explicitly parallels this process with Humean empirical investigation, the player accumulating enough game experiences to speculate about what the rules of a game are and how particular actions will be responded to by the world, parallels the empirical subject, attempting to combat the provisionality of their understanding through a process of endless inquiry. And nowhere is this transformation more apparent than in the process of cognitive mapping, as articulated by Gordon Kalea in his In Game from 2011. He says that cognitive maps of the area start being built on the basis of chains of landmarks and recognizable routes one moves through over and over again. As these are learned, a sense of comfort and belonging settles in, creating an attachment between player and game environment. This sense of attachment and familiarity can be seen as the distinguishing factor between perceiving an environment not only as space, but also as place. This process of forming a mental map of a game world provides one of the core principles of Kalea's concept of incorporation, which he defines as the absorption of a virtual environment into consciousness, yielding a sense of habitation, which is paralleled by the embodiment of the player in a single location in a virtual world through the avatar. The second of these points I'll touch on momentarily, but for now it's worth noting that Kalea identifies that players develop a mental surrogate of the game space, the intensity of which is dictated by affective qualities of attachment and familiarity. Like the readers of Gothic literature or Hume's empirical subjects, players experiencing Kalean incorporation are being transformed by fictional impressions as if they were real. The worlds of Metroidvania games deploy a range of tropes familiar from the literary Gothic to produce this same sense of heightened affectivity experienced by Radcliffe's early readers. There are many examples of the uncanny, objects which are conventionally either background or inanimate obstacles suddenly springing to life, such as this ghostly painting and living alcove from Blasphemous, or the jump scare inducing corpse creeper from Hollow Knight, all of which train the player into an acute paranoid attention to their avatar's surroundings, kept in a state of hyper-attention in which a critical perspective on the environment is withheld for the duration of the play experience. The genre's use of vertical spaces is also significant. When Metroid was released in 1986, the platforming landscape was dominated by the side-scrolling Super Mario franchise, and the navigation of the world through tunnels connected to unifying vertical shafts offers a new perspective on a medium which had hitherto killed you just for touching the bottom of the screen. The genre also makes heavy use of Gothic motifs of decay and ruin in its visual language, with games set in post-apocalyptic necropoli, hostile planets, and threateningly fecund natural spaces. The screen grab from Hollow Knight at the center of this slide is an indicative example of some of the features I've mentioned. It depicts the abyss space in the game, which is roughly at the center of the game's map, reached by dropping down a long shaft. The background is made up of the corpses of other insects which have died here, in an extreme deferral to the Gothic fascination with the ultimate materiality of human, or in this case, insect, bodies. The eeriness of the space is further enhanced by the threat of shades, which are ghosts that materialize unexpectedly out of the air and attack the avatar. Metroidvania worlds are also often occupied by bodies with permeable or unstable boundaries, sometimes appearing as a lack of corporeal stability, like the monstrous transformed figures which populate the world of Blasphemous, or the relics and dismembered body parts which fill the game's inventory. It could also be a blurring between body and environment, like the corpse of the giant worm in Hollow Knight, or the still living body of the giant caterpillar Bardoon, visible across several screens of play. Where the concept of the permeable body intersects with the aforementioned concept of the monstrous feminine, we find the Metroid Queen, whose horrifying fecundity borrows the threat of unbridled reproductive capability from its initial inspiration, the xenomorph queen in James Cameron's Aliens, 1986. The other aspect of bodily permeability, which is most on display across the genre, is the omnipresence of excessive, absurd gore. Playthroughs of games like Blasphemous and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night involve the accumulation of body counts in the thousands, and in the case of Blasphemous, the game world being inflected through artistic representations of the Spanish Inquisition cause images of flagellation and bodily degradation, like the one I've chosen here, to be extremely common. Images of disembowelment and dismembering literalize the instability of the body's boundaries. All my GIFs are going, good. It's not just the NPCs in Metroidvania worlds which have permeable bodies. Avatars within the game are just as unstable. As I mentioned in my first slide, navigation through space in Metroidvania games is contingent on the collection of objects which enable new mechanics for movement. These objects are invariably tied to the disembodiment or transformation of the player's avatar. Here we can see Alucard transforming into a bat in Symphony of the Night, Samus turning into a ball to negotiate a small space in Metroid, the Knight using the Shade Cloak to cross a barrier in Hollow Knight. And this example from Blasphemous, which isn't actually to do with movement, but is one of a number of actions which involve the player character Il Penitente cutting himself and using his blood for various purposes. These plastic porous bodies serve a double effective purpose. They resonate with the concept of objection, which we heard about just now, highlighting the horror of corporeal instability, the external becoming internal, and vice versa. And this is the function which they share with their literary Gothic counterparts. What the concept also introduces, however, in the context of the player's avatar specifically, is an in-game iteration of what scholars such as Poppy Wilde have described as the entanglement between player and avatar. As Wilde observes in her discussion of the 2003 game Beyond Good and Evil, the relationship between player and avatar is one of rhizomatic entanglement, the subject-object boundary breaking down the ineffective identification experienced between the player and the character. Beyond Good and Evil trains its players in the cultivation of these connections through the protagonist Jade's own participation in a post-human community of objects, specifically the tools which she uses throughout the game. I would argue that the way in which Metroidvanias use their tools provide a comparably radical invitation to post-human identification, inviting the player to not only consider their effective relationship with the literal object of the avatar itself, but one that keeps reminding the player of its objectness by unnaturally warping its shape. The evolution of the empathic relationship between player and avatar is also experienced in the way in which Metroidvanias, traditional Metroidvanias, utilize their in-game maps. The aforementioned minimalism and the fact that the player has to complete the map, has to fill in the map as they progress through it, means that the cognitive map which the player is composing in their head resonates with the experience of their character, and the effective function of dislocation is experienced as a mutual relationship. The way in which save points work across the game facilitates this, with players often striking out into an unknown area and within an hour or so finding themselves desperately looking for the next save point to lock in their progress, or retracing their steps to get back to safety. This process of conditional inquiry, or speculation, to use the term which Cameron Kunzelman applies to the concept, is literalized in the case of Hollow Knight, in which the in-game map is not itself updated until the knight reaches one of the benches which serve as save points, or the player falls back on the post-human community of non-player characters, finding Cornifer the cartographer, who appears at various locations in the world, selling mostly complete maps of the area. One of the characteristics which adds to the horror of the abyss, which I mentioned earlier, is the fact that in order to reach it, you put a long and difficult climb between yourself and the nearest bench, making you extremely vulnerable. Even once the game spaces have been explored, the in-game map remains so abstract as to be meaningless, except in regards to spatial relationships and the occasional landmark. Until the player has learned to read the geography of the game world, there is no difference between a square containing a secret boss and one containing nothing at all, making the in-game map less of a tool in itself and more of a prompt for the player to refer to their own cognitive map of the space. The presences of invisible doors or breakable floors enhance this feeling of empirical discovery under limited conditions. And the fact that while game progress is explicitly linked to what percentage of the map has been filled, this can sometimes exceed 100%, removing even the most basic metric by which the player can orient their cognitive map to the complete game world without deferring to external resources like fan wikis. All of this serves to enhance playerly investment in the development of a cognitive map. But by tying it to intense emotions, the panic of dislocation, the sweet relief when you hear Cornifer's iconic humming. There is one more trick, however, which Metroidvania games following the model of Castlevania Symphony of the Night have pulled. And it was this concept which served as the initial inspiration for this paper in the first place. Okay, I'm a little short on time, so if you watch this GIF in the background while I continue, it is a recording of my playthrough of Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, demonstrating the map inversion mechanic. You can see Miriam moving regularly on the ground, reversing gravity, navigating a parallel space on the ceiling, discorporating to negotiate some obstacles, and then finally reaching a new area radically inaccessible from the ground. The upside-down castle in Castlevania Symphony of the Night was primarily a pragmatic move to allow the reuse of game assets, but in so doing, it created an iconic moment for the genre, which has been paralleled later by Hollow Knight, when an outbreak of infected pustules in the late game transforms the now familiar contours of the game space, which the player has spent dozens of hours exploring. By introducing an entire other world onto the blueprint of the original, these games replicate the confrontation with the unknown and the inexplicable, which is at the heart of Gothic epistemology. The speculative process with which the player-avatar combination has carefully developed an understanding of the world is revealed to have been false, and the cognitive map must be redrawn. The game has pulled the bait-and-switch mechanism of the revealed supernatural into the framework of the game itself, and revealed that the process of navigating the game world is not, in fact, about the empirical investigation of a finite digital space, but about the development of an increasingly detailed cognitive map of the player's own experience, with all the conditional and emotional elements that entails. To refer back to my title quotation, the player comes out of the experience changed, just like the reader of early Gothic literature, with the provisionality and contingency of their understanding made viscerally apparent. And that's the end.